So this is a continuation of the series of videos I've been making. This is the either or versus both and categories. So I'll do just a little tutorial on it. So I would actually recommend some of my previous videos I've done on dichotomies. Including subject and object, us versus them. So this would fit in perfectly with the previous videos I've made. So let's try to briefly chew on either or categories that people often use in mapping out ideas or categorizing the way they think versus both and distinctions or both and categories. Right? So on the either or side, that's clearly the use of dichotomies. So what I did there is just make a list of several classic examples in which either or categories are utilized to simplify the world into two different domains where there is no third or fourth dimension. Right? It just is reduced down to either master-slave, good and evil, determinism versus free will, right? Elite versus the mass, fascist versus communist, male, female, in politics, left versus right, even eliminating anything in the center. And a lot of this can be traced back with classical thinkers who would use dichotomies, okay? But I decided to select the German jurist Carl Schmitt, where he argued that politics, the nature of politics, is all about reducing it down to friend and enemy, right? That's the whole domain of politics. For him, he thought that this was at the heart of it, of antagonism. I'll discuss Marcuse in just a second and how he also addressed these problems of either or categories being used. Let's go ahead and briefly just chew on both and kind of distinctions or both and categories. As it applies, I mean, if you listen to it, both and considers aspects that are beyond the either or categories. Okay, they could be non-binary, for instance. Okay, have a third or multiple dimensions. Could have hybrid forms. Let's call it something in the middle. It can have a gray area. Okay, and what I decided to do there is give some examples of historical figures like Friedrich Nietzsche in his book Beyond Good and Evil. He also kind of argued as a philosopher that we use good and evil categories, we moralize too much, and we should try to move beyond these simple good and evil distinctions. Another example is from the standpoint of political history in Europe. The famous quote by Alexander Dubček in 1968, around the time of the Prague Spring, where he uses the phrase socialism with a human face. The idea here for him as a reformer was to move away from this hard left, state totalitarian approach and something more in the middle, some kind of a soft socialism, right? That would for him be the goal of reform in Czechoslovakia in the late 1960s. Okay, so let's briefly go back to either or and some of the limitations of using such categories. The sociologist and philosopher of the Frankfurt School, Herbert Marcuse, wrote a book called One-Dimensional Man in 1964, where he basically criticized the way ideologies function in the West and in the East, and how people are polarized through these worldviews of putting everything into capitalist versus communist kind of categories. So he argued this is an example of one-dimensional man, right? As a kind of eliminating alternative ways of looking at history. Okay, so Herbert Marcuse, classic theorist that tries to also criticize this either-or distinctions. Okay, so let's move again over to both and in the world of social science. Feminist theory comes to mind. Some examples that I gave there is intersectionalism, intersectional theory by Kimberly Crenshaw. Has aspects of both and rather than either or categories. It could be multiple categories that are used by theorists to try to theorize on inequality in the world that looks at categories not just, let's say, economic class, but rather gender or race, right? And other aspects, right? So that's an example of both and considerations. The political sociologist Anthony Giddens in the UK wrote a book around 1990 called Third Way that also kind of was attempting to break out of these either-or categories that often doom the left. So he was trying to reform the old left, old labor politics into something new labor, so kind of a mixture of not being too far to the left and something more into center, or a center-right reorganization of party principles. Okay. One last example I decided to use is the book by Hall and Susky in 2001, where they also are trying to move beyond just assuming that capitalism is capitalism and there's really no variations. In their book, they argue that there are variations. And whether it's, liberal democratic kind of systems or coordinated capitalist systems, that there's even varieties within capitalism, for example, right? So both and dimensions. So just try to chew on some of these, and I encourage everybody to do a little bit more reading on your own, to think about when either or aspects or framing occurs, or both and considerations are included in the way people theorize or frame things.